Okay, everyone. Hello, welcome, welcome. I hope you're having a great UX, y'all, and I hope that you've seen a lot of great stuff from Mike and Shara and Ali and Santanita. They did some great talks, and so I am the MC for today's lightning talks. And so for the lightning talks, we have four different presentations for y'all. Each of them will be 10 minutes long, and we're going to do it so that we're going to ask questions all together at the end. We'll have about 5 minutes at the end for questions. So please continue to add your questions in the Q&A tab, and I will be making sure to check on those, and I will ask them at the end. But first up, we'll have Kilian Valkhof. He is the founder of Polypane, a browser for ambitious developers, and has 20 years of experience in front-end development. Today, he'll share new media features that let you adapt your site to user preferences in his talk, An Inclusive Web, using preference media queries to make your sites for everyone. Next up, we'll have Theresa Nguyen and Brian Utesch. Theresa and Brian are both at IBM, Theresa as a UX researcher and Brian as a senior technical staff member and design research practice lead. For this talk, they've analyzed 100 UX researcher job postings to gather data on the themes that link those postings, and will share those qualitative and quantitative results with you today. Following that, we'll have Jasmine Stammes. Jasmine is currently at Urban Footprint as a user experience researcher. She spends her time helping organizations better understand the people they are designing for, and describes herself as a subjective researcher, which she'll share more about in her talk today. And finally, Jessie Huff will join us. She is an accessibility lead and front-end developer at Red Hat and leads the company's open source design system, Patternfly. Today, she'll share her talk, Accessibility from Concept to Reality, about how to take the idea of accessibility and apply it in practice. So again, please add your questions in the Q&A panel, and we'll ask them at the end all together. So welcome. We'll now kick things off with Kilian.
Thanks, Brooke. So, on Inclusive Web, on using preference media queries to make your site work for everyone. Hi, I'm Kilian, the creator of Polypane, the browser for building websites. And I'm here to tell you about user preference media queries. A little over a decade ago, there was a paradigm shift in web development. In 2010, the term responsive design was introduced as a way to describe how we can make websites adapt to the screen size by reflowing and repositioning content as the available space allows. But we can adapt to more than just screen sizes. With responsive websites, we can have a design that's responsive, as well as a website that adapts to user preferences, providing an experience catered to each user's unique needs. Here's how. Browsers are implementing a new set of media queries that let developers respond to preferences that the user might have as to how a website should look and work for them. In this presentation, I'll go over each, but due to time limits, we won't be spending a ton of time with them. I'll link to more resources at the end of the presentation. With preferred color scheme, or as most of us call it, dark mode, a user indicates whether they prefer to see a light or dark version of your site. Users might prefer a dark version because it's easier on their eyes, or a light version because it usually has increased contrast. Using the preferred color scheme media query, we can check for both dark and light. There used to be a no preference option as well, but it got removed since it was essentially the same as light mode. Most of you will have a website in light mode. Adding a dark mode from scratch can be a big project. If you want to add dark mode, but don't have a lot of time, you can use something called cheap dark mode. It works like this. Using CSS, we invert the entire page using the invert filter. This makes everything that's dark light and the other way around. Unfortunately, what this also does is invert the hue. So anything that's blue becomes orange, for example. That's not great. You can't have your brand color suddenly be different. So we use another filter to rotate the hue by 180 degrees, which means we end up with the original hue. It won't match your colors perfectly, but it's usually close enough. At this point, images and videos will look pretty bad, so we need to fix that. We can do that by adding an invert and U-rotate filter again, basically undoing the previous changes. The background color at this point hasn't changed along, so we have to add an explicit background color. In the example here, I've chosen a dark gray, but you can also add a little bit of color, depending on what works best for your site. And here's what that would look like. On the left, the regular site, and on the right, the cheap dark mode one. Now, this isn't perfect, and it's not as good as a fully custom dark theme, but it will get you something decent in a few lines of code. On to prefers reduced motion. Users can indicate they want to see less stuff happening on screen with the prefers reduced motion media query. The reason they want to do this can be things like motion sickness, vestibular disorders, or just that they don't have time to wait for your nice animations. If a user has this turned on, it doesn't mean you can't show any motion. But you have to be mindful. Use motion only where it helps understanding, and prefer animations that fade rather than move. And for videos, don't autoplay them. In terms of CSS, the prefers reduced motion media query is a Boolean. It's either on with reduce or off with no preference. Now, the best way to approach this is to consider motion as a progressive enhancement. Design your site without motion and only add in animations when the user has no preference. But if that's not an option, or the site is already built, you can use the prefers reduced motion reduce option to turn animations off. For example, with cheap reduced motion. Now, this is a very crude way of doing it. It will just turn all animation and transitions off. You can see some weird values in here, like -1 milliseconds. That's to make sure that the animations still play, just that they take 0 seconds in total. This way, any JavaScript APIs that depend on animation end or transition end will still be called. While the previous media queries are supported across browsers, the next few have no or very limited support. So consider them a preview of what we can do in the near future. Not everyone is lucky enough to have fast or reliable internet or unlimited data plans. Browsers can send the saved data on header, and web servers can then choose to send smaller images and videos and disable any forms of preloading, server push, or polling. Now, doing this on the server is often hard to do because you, as a developer or designer, lack access to the server configuration, or the configuration requirements to make this happen are just too complex. That's unfortunate because it can have a big impact on who gets to see and use your website. Luckily, coming up is the preferred reduced data media query. It's not available in browsers yet, but you can emulate it after changing some settings in Chrome and out of the box in Polypane. Though you can do less with it than the HTTP header, which would let you send an entirely different website, this is much more accessible for us implementers. You can prevent downloading fonts and background images, or choose to download smaller images. And in JavaScript, with the Match Media API, you can prevent preloading and polling. Almost as unsupported is prefers contrast. This indicates whether your user wants to show your site with less or more contrast. It can be difficult for people with visual impairments to pick up subtle differences in color, and they will prefer a higher contrast. On the other hand, people with light sensitivity issues might prefer a screen with less harsh contrasts. While most browsers do not support this yet, the current Safari technology preview supports prefers contrast with the more value, and that activates when a user turns on the increased contrast accessibility option in the macOS settings. With prefers reduced transparency, users can indicate that they want to see text on a solid background. They want this usually due to visual impairments, making it hard to read text on patterned backgrounds, but it can also help people with dyslexia or concentration problems. Unfortunately, right now, there is no browser support. Still, like reduced motion, there's two options. And once support lands, Consider again to make the reduce case the default and only add your transparencies when the no preference media query matches. The next two media queries do not have a prefers prefix, since they do not require you to make changes. However, you can use them to detect changes and compensate for them. Inverted colors is a Mac-only feature, and forced colors is a Windows-only feature. Inverted colors is an option that is only supported on macOS. It doesn't start with prefers because the operating system and the browser, Safari in this case, have already inverted the colors for you. You might think you need to use this media query to double invert images and videos like we did for cheap dark mode, but Safari already does this for you. You can, however, still U-shift your entire site to make sure your brand colors are still somewhat followed. In general, I think prefers color scheme and the dark mode in macOS is more or less the successor to this setting and media query. The values look like this. It's either none or inverted. On the Windows side, we have forced colors, which map to the Windows High Contrast mode. Windows High Contrast mode lets users specify and override all the colors on their operating system. Usually, this is used to create high contrast black on white or white on black color schemes, but it can also be used for sepia or even wilder color schemes. The media query does not begin with prefers, so your browser already has overwritten all the colors on your site and makes everything uniform with the rest of your operating system. Force colors can either be active when on or none when off. And in addition, if a dark background color scheme is chosen, prefers color scheme dark, so browser dark mode, will also match. Because all the colors have already been overwritten by the browser, there's not really much for you to do, except make sure that things like SVG icons are still visible. And because you don't know which color scheme the user decided to use, you can't use your own colors for this. Instead, you can use these CSS names that map to the colors that the user has chosen. Now, these three options seem similar, but do not serve the same purpose. Forced colors overrides all your styling to something the user wanted, often with significantly increased contrast. With prefers contrast, it's your job to increase the contrast, but the user would still like to see your design. Lastly, inverted colors has no explicit goal. It's mostly just used to make screens less bright. This was, in a nutshell, the list of current user preference media queries. Throughout this presentation, I used Polypane, the browser for developers and designers. Please check it out at polypane.com to start a free trial to play around with these media queries in an easy and user-friendly way. I'm Kilian Valkhof, and you can find me at these places. If you want to read more about all the media queries, check out the link on screen. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you very much. Thank you. That was awesome. We'll bring Kilian back up at the end so that we can have him answer some questions. So make sure that you're leaving your questions in the chat for him about what his presentation was all about. Thanks again, Kilian.
My pleasure.
All right, Theresa and Brian, I'll hand it over to you.
Okay, awesome. Thank you, Brooke. Okay, so hi everyone. We're really excited to be presenting our lightning talk today, the UX Researcher Checklist, an analysis of 100 UX researcher job postings. My name is Theresa Nguyen, and I am a UX researcher in IBM Automation.
And I'm Brian Utesch. I'm a user research practice lead in IBM Marketing.
Okay, so a little bit about the analysis we did. So we wanted to provide an objective benchmark of capability for UX researchers. So UX researchers, regardless of years of experience or job status, should be constantly evaluating themselves to ensure that their skill set is up to date. So what we did was we analyzed open job postings on LinkedIn, where the requirements of the position across multiple domains and industries offers us insights into themes. And then here are some of the companies that had open UX researcher job postings that we pulled from. And we ended up analyzing 100 UX researcher job postings to develop themes. So for example, in the case of Peloton, the exercise equipment and media company, we carefully examined the opening job posting for this role. And ultimately we, oops, oh, sorry. Okay, sorry about that. And ultimately, we observed key values from job postings, such as what are the top responsibilities for the UX researcher, what disciplines were sought after, the skills, expertise, and the kinds of collaborators that UX researchers work with. So on to the findings. So we grouped the top 16 responsibilities of the UX researcher into 4 categories, which I'll dive into in more detail, along with how prominent the job responsibilities were among the 100 job postings. So first, it makes sense that the UX researcher's main job responsibility is to, of course, conduct research. So designing research studies was found in 59% of the job postings, and then conducting those studies was virtually in every job posting. So researchers need to know a variety of research methods, but even more important than knowing how to use these methods is knowing when to use these methods. So it's important for researchers to be skillful in qualitative and quantitative methods, as well as evaluative and generative research. Lastly, creating research roadmaps and working in an agile and/or design thinking environment were also found to be responsibilities that were prevalent in job postings. The next category of job responsibilities refers to what happens after the research study has been conducted. So the UX researcher will need to analyze their data and synthesize insights from the data into meaningful themes, and also be able to triangulate data from different sources to create a more compelling narrative. Something that I learned while I was in school was to utilize a see, say, do triangle, in which you factor in what the users actually do, what the users say, and what the researcher sees and how the users interact with the design. And then after all the data has been collected, analyzed, and synthesized, the UX researcher will need to then turn those findings into actionable insights and communicate those insights in a compelling way to all the relevant stakeholders. And it might also be necessary to socialize your insights throughout the entire company beyond your direct team. In terms of the more business-oriented responsibilities, the UX researcher will need to scope out research projects and work with stakeholders to break down and understand specific needs and questions. And they will need to translate those business needs into research projects and ultimately execute against it. UX researchers will also be expected to influence design and product strategy through their research, while advocating for UX by being empathetic to user needs, championing the target user, and evangelizing UX research throughout the organization. And then in this last section, we have job responsibilities that kept coming up in our analyses, but didn't fit neatly into the other groupings of the previous sections. So the first was developing research operations, such as developing a research repository, usability standards, or best practices. And next, researchers will also be expected to not only collaborate with diverse teams, but also serve as a mentor. And finally, helping to promote and foster a culture of user research, and also always learning and evolving with the field of UX are other responsibilities necessary for today's UX researcher. So now I'll be handing it off to Brian to talk about the various skills necessary for the UX researcher.
All right, thanks, Theresa. So in analyzing these 100 job openings, we came up with 12 soft skill themes that emerged. And among those, 3 in particular came out as the most mentioned. Those were collaborative, creative, and passionate. And there were some others that were also mentioned sort of secondary to those primary, but I'll focus mostly on the primary. So in terms of collaborative, the successful user researcher should be able to work collaboratively in a cross-functional way, collaboratively cross-program to develop programmatic approaches to research, and then collaboratively in terms of bringing in different methods to creatively solve problems. From a passion perspective, the user researcher is successful when they have the conviction to help. They really are going into this role to make a difference, to focus on evangelizing the need for user research and focusing on data over opinion. And then finally, in terms of being creative, looking at creating design solutions to accommodate and address the problems and insights that are identified in testing, creative ways of solving problems, and creative ways of recruiting users to complete those studies. So next I'll talk about expertise. So we evaluated expertise in terms of the methods that were mentioned the most often. And we visualized this in a target format where those methods that are mentioned the most often are those in the middle, followed by those further out were mentioned less often. And this covered behavioral and attitudinal methods, quantitative and qualitative methods, and evaluative and generative methods. Next, I'll talk about discipline expertise. So we're talking about specific areas of education and where individuals should be focused. Primarily, you see almost 9 in 10 of these jobs mention human-computer interaction, or HCI, followed by psychology and human factors. What's even more interesting is the emphasis on social sciences. So there's a great deal of diversity in terms of the backgrounds of individuals who go into user research. And design and computer science, although not social sciences, certainly are related to the user research disciplines mentioned here. Also, I want to point out in terms of human factors and human-computer interaction, although those are not primarily social sciences, you will see those degrees in social science schools or degree programs. And then I'll talk finally about collaborators. So we identified those collaborators that are mentioned the most often as core. So primarily a user researcher is interfacing with product and program owners to understand the business needs, help prioritize the backlog. Next, collaborating with designers in terms of creating stimuli for testing, iterating on that, and then providing those insights back into design. And then finally, collaborating with developers and engineers to implement the findings that come out of research and the insights and make those real and live. We did find that user researchers were mentioned not very often, surprisingly, but we believe that's because it was just assumed that user researchers would interface with other user researchers within a team. Next chart. So in summary, this data is used to help 4 primary audiences. 1, students, those who are still in their degree program, and help guide them in terms of what skills and disciplines and methods are in demand in the marketplace. Job seekers who are actively looking for jobs and who want to make sure they're competitive. Experienced professionals who may be looking to self-evaluate, understand where they fit and if their skills are currently up to date. And then job posters using this data as a starting point that can then be modified and tweaked to be applicable to their particular job opening. Then finally, where you might take this data. So really understand where you might have where you might be lacking in terms of some of these skills and methods. We encourage you to move outside of your comfort zone, apply research methods you may not have applied in the past. Look at some of these soft skills and self-evaluate or whether these are things that you currently have or you can work on. And then finally, periodically evaluate yourself against some of these objective benchmarks. And finally, I want to point out that we have a lot more data here that we're unable to talk about in 10 minutes. And I will post a link to this in the chat, and you can look at more of the details at your leisure. Thank you.
Awesome job, you two. Thank you so much for all of that. And I know that we have some great questions for you, so we'll ask you that at the end, but we'll see you in a second. And welcome back to the stage, Jasmine. We are so excited for your presentation, so I'll turn it over to you.
Hello. Afternoon, everyone. I'm so happy you all are taking a slice of your time to be here today. I'm really excited to be present here. I'm bringing to you some energy. I just found out that my best friend is having a baby 5 minutes ago. So you all are on a journey with me right now as I move through this presentation. Once again, my name is Jasmine Stammes. I'm a UX researcher at a company called Urban Footprint. Prior to my current position, I worked as a UX researcher at a digital agency called Viget. Both positions really allowed me to orient my thinking around reclaiming the word subjective in the realm of research. So today, I'm hoping that I move through the basic tenets of what I call subjective research and how I think you all can also practice this form of research. So what is subjective research? Wait, shouldn't we be talking about objective research? Nah, that's really last century. When we think of the word research, right, the world often emphasizes this notion of being objective. Being objective is seen as the antidote to favoritism and bias. But much work in the last decades, particularly in anti-racism realms, clearly demonstrates that a notion that any of us can be free from bias is a real fallacy, right? Especially not in systems and structures that truly have shaped and been founded by racism and all the myriads of isms. There's the myth, right, of this anthropologist sitting at the corner of the village in khaki pants and a clipboard, writing about the habits of the quote unquote natives. But that's a long buried notion. We now know that the anthropologist was never an objective party, but often simply a person that was unable to see how their lens was often deeply clouded by being a cis hetero white man. Pretending we exist outside the scope of society just isn't the move. Acknowledging the ways we are part of society, rather, understanding the filters we have and the lens that we hold because of those filters, being subjective, part of, rather than objective, a part of, is the true liberatory method. So how does one shift their mindset into this practice of intentional subjective research? Well, the first challenge I have for you all is to really understand that they are not two opposites. And there isn't this false binary that makes us feel like being subjective means that we're conducting bias-filled and favoritism-filled research. Being a subjective researcher is really about tuning and reading the self in a way that shifts one's research practice. The tenets of subjective research are positionality, empathy, ethics, and really centering the subjective experience. So I'm going to take a moment to expound on three of those: positionality, empathy, and ethics. So broadly speaking, positionality is the notion that our personal values, views, and location in time and space influence how we understand the worlds we're in and the worlds we live in. Our positions or identities all hold certain forms of access or lack thereof. Some aspects of positionality are dynamic while others are static, but all aspects of positionality are informed by place and time. Frankly speaking, the work of UX research to me can be, in large part, a process of building a relationship in a really short span of time. Your positionality can make it hard or easy, depending on your pre-existing relationships and connections to said identity group. Being grounded in positionality sometimes is about realizing that knowing your limits, engaging in a way where you step back if someone else needs to lean in, being transparent about your access, and advocating when necessary. But ultimately, positionality is about working and doing the internal work to unravel the biases braided into all of our identities through the systems we've lived in and worked in this certain place, in this certain time. Empathy is the ability to fully understand, mirror, then share another person's expressions, needs, and motivations. In UX, we're sometimes really fatigued by the word empathy, right? We've heard it so many times, and it starts to sound like a broken record. But empathy is a soft skill. And the thing about soft skills is it's a muscle that takes years and years to exercise. It's a practice that's built through action and consistency. Concern yourself less with whether empathy is in trend or not, but rather lean into the hard work of soft things and begin to build a practice around empathy that is lifelong rather than project-bound. A soft reminder that empathy is not the same as sympathy. Sympathy is often externalized. Empathy is about metabolizing that pain point into a right-sized solution. Lastly, research ethics is the careful consideration of the rights, well-being, and dignity of people involved in research activities. History has had notorious shortfalls, a few of which I listed here. But research ethics is ultimately about care for the users and participants that is grounded in more than what you want from them. To be subjective is to be in a practice of community care. Community care is ethics in action. A practice of care would have made it impossible for doctors in the Tuskegee study to watch their patients die and suffer for years in the name of research. Intentional and rooted care is the root of all ethical research. It is about putting people before studies. And so for the next few minutes, I want to talk about how you can actually move into these as a practice, move into positionality, empathy, and ethics, and how you can really start to embed it not only in your personal practice, but in your research practice. So my first practice for you all is to position yourselves. Each of us has identities that we sit in, whether it's your race, your education, your social class, your gender. Take a moment to list and reflect on all the aspects of your identities. Understand the way in which your lens impacts the work you do. What are the benefits? What are the disadvantages? And how can you mitigate based on the biases you might carry? Don't try to escape your identity. Lean into your identity and do the internal work to escape the isms instead. Practice number 2, practice empathy. Empathy is often about taking a step back, learning to be a good listener, improving your observation skills, not being afraid to ask for input, being mindful of your own attitude, learning how to be humble, filled with humility, and doing your research when you don't know enough. And lastly, practice number 3, be ethically grounded in your research practice. Be respectful to your users, honor participants' limits, and value their comfort. Be responsible to your users. Act to protect people's current and future interests, and be honest with your users. Always be truthful and timely in all of your communication. This concludes my presentation. I'm so thankful that I was here with you all. I hope that you all see that this is a practice that you can embed in your research practice. I also hope you know that this is an evolving practice for me, and there's much to learn and much to move into. But I hope your interests were piqued, and I hope I can connect with you all, and that your next research engagement just has a little bit more subjective practice in it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jasmine. That was awesome. Thank you for your delightful presentation, and we will see you back here for questions at the end. And lastly, let's welcome Jessie to the stage. Jessie, welcome on in. We're excited to hear your presentation. I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Brooke. Let me go ahead and share my screen. Hi, I'm Jessie Huff, and I'm the accessibility lead for Patternfly, Red Hat's design system for our products. Today, I want to talk through the accessible experience and give you some ideas of how you can take this concept and make it a reality in your own work. There are many approaches to accessibility, but it's all about thinking through what our users would experience. There are 2 main tools we're going to talk about today, and that's the keyboard and the screen reader. Keyboard users could be people with motor impairments who have difficulty with the fine motor movements required for using a mouse, and screen reader users could be someone who is blind or an impaired user who relies on assistive technology and can't see where to click the mouse. However, there are many different types of users that can fit into these categories and other categories. For example, someone with dyslexia might use a screen reader to help them understand the context of the page. Then we're going to talk about how to take this understanding of the accessible experience and include it in the design, development, and testing process, and hopefully do a quick live demo at the end. When it comes to keyboard user experience, a massive part of it is, can a user navigate to everything on the page with the keyboard? There are two general considerations with keyboard accessibility, and that's going to be whether this is a native element or something custom. Native interactive elements will already be included in the tab order. These are going to be things like your links, buttons, etc. But if you're building something custom, you probably need to look into the expected keyboard interaction and pay more attention to focus management, looking into attributes like tab index to better understand tab order. Tab is going to be the main way to navigate through a page, but some other interactions are enter in space to initiate an interaction, arrow keys within the interaction pattern, escape to leave it, and shift tab to go backwards. There are a lot of differences between screen readers, but the main three are going to be NVDA, JAWS, and VoiceOver. Our strategy has been to pick one and narrow in on that, as it can be difficult to satisfy all of them, but when you focus on one, it can be a little bit easier. Our choice has been VoiceOver just due to the availability to our team, and I often hear designers and developers asking for an exhaustive list of everything to consider for a screen reader, but sometimes it's easier just to open up a screen reader. This will allow you to far more quickly understand what your issues might be. I know that it can be intimidating to open up a screen reader for the first time, but just learning the very basic commands can actually get you pretty far. And there's a lot of guides out there to help you. A sighted user can take a look at this page and kind of get an idea of how the information is being structured and communicated. Screen reader users have alternative ways of doing that. Screen readers are typically able to navigate by categories such as headings, links, form controls, articles, and landmarks. So it's important that we're communicating this information structure. So one does not simply select headings based on size, style, or color. It should be based on the information architecture and what you're trying to communicate. I'm going to play a quick screen reader demo so you can kind of get an idea of how this might sound.
The computer I'm using is a perfectly normal laptop running Windows 10. This is the software where the magic happens. I use a program called screen.
English is commonly spoken at around 120 to 150 words per minute, but some screen reader users have trained themselves to understand more than 450 words per minute. So it may seem like a disadvantage can sometimes be an advantage. So often when people think of accessibility, they just think of someone who is blind or someone with a physical impairment, but there's so many situational, temporary, and permanent cases that users will experience. Perhaps your user is a non-fluent speaker, so having clear, concise language will really benefit them. Or maybe next month you break your arm and now using a mouse is extremely difficult, so you start using your keyboard to navigate pages. Accessibility affects more than just one user or user group. So cool, where do we start? Well, when it comes to design, there are some visual aspects we should consider. To start, there's a user's visual acuity or sharpness of vision, 20/20 being standard, and field of vision. Field of vision is the area of vision people can see clearly when their eyes are in a fixed position. People generally have a field of vision of approximately 180 degrees from left to right and 150 degrees up and down, with the sharpest vision in the central 5 degrees and color vision in the central 20 degrees. Types of visual field loss are typically grouped as central field loss, vision is reduced or absent in the middle of someone's vision, peripheral field loss, or vision is limited to the central portion of their visual field, sometimes called tunnel vision, or other field loss. This example shows how field of vision could affect design. On the left side, we have a ticket machine that has poor clarity of layout, and it's viewed from normal vision and then also with poor peripheral vision. The right side shows a redesigned layout for the same machine, but it enables the overall layout to be perceived even with peripheral vision loss. Color is a big one when it comes to our designs. Two things will greatly affect the user experience with your design, and that's going to be contrast and light sensitivity, which will be things like your combination of colors, and color perception, which will be things like your use of colors. So looking at this example, we have a bunch of variations of color combinations, and they're using fairly dark colors, so you'd think they'd pass color contrast. However, none of these combinations of colors pass. These colors can still be used in an accessible way, but when they're combined in a low contrast combination, it's not very accessible to a number of users with visual impairments. Your use of color is also going to be really important because a lot of users have different perceptions of colors, which will affect how they interpret your designs. For example, you should never use just color to communicate information because different users may see those colors differently. Red for a danger alert may look completely different for someone who has complete red-green disability. So it's important to add visible text or some other indicator other than just color to communicate information. This is an example of an accessible design mockup that uses a basic formula that is easy for developers to follow. It points out the purpose, naming, interaction, etc. And if possible, avoid hard-coding names to allow for future localization. When developing, you should think through these three questions. Is it discoverable or perceivable by all users? Basically, can you see or click on it? Can you easily navigate to it by keyboard or by screen reader? Is it interactable? If you can get to it, how easy is it to actually use once you've focused on the element? Can you interact with the element by keyboard? For example, if it's a button, can you press enter to initiate the action? Can you use a screen reader to initiate the action? And is it understandable? If the element can be found and interacted with, is it clear what this action does? If it's a button, does it have visible text that would be clear out of context of the page? If it doesn't have visible text, does it have an ARIA label or an accessible name? So you should think through these expected interactions, and when developing, you might need to look into roles, ARIA attributes, and focus management. The flow of information of your page should make sense. Because screen readers navigate the page in DOM order, if you've used CSS to visually reposition elements, they may be announced in a nonsensical sequence. If you need something to appear earlier in the page, try to physically move it earlier in the DOM. A big question I get asked is when to use labels. A response I often have is there visible text? Often if there's visible text, then there doesn't need to be an ARIA label. ARIA aids in the description to screen reader users. It doesn't have to reiterate or override what might already be there. It's important to understand that ARIA can only affect the semantics of an element. It has no effect on the behavior of the element. For example, while you can make an element hidden to screen readers with ARIA hidden equals true, that doesn't change the focus behavior for that element. And please remember that ARIA labels are for humans, so don't use something like ARIA label equals form control 1. A common example I see is using something vague as a link text like read more. For a sighted user, they can see the correlation of the card, but out of context in a screen reader, this is really confusing. So it's really important to have clear, concise link text that explains the context of the link or button. For example, read more about kitties instead of just read more. When it comes to testing, you can start by validating your HTML as this is your foundation. You can add accessibility automation like Axe to your CI/CD build like we have a screenshot of on the right side. This can test all of your work for quick accessibility errors before going into your code base. You can do manual testing with a keyboard or a screen reader, and you can add integration testing with something like Cypress, especially for keyboard interactions. However, you should be teaching accessibility knowledge across the team as this affects every aspect of your project. Now I want to do a quick demo for you. I'm going to run through the automation testing, keyboard, and then voiceover really quickly. So I'm going to switch tabs to an example. So Axe is, oops, not page source. Axe is a Chrome extension. So if I go to inspect and I find Axe DevTools, I can test for any quick accessibility errors. I can scan all my page, and this will highlight any quick errors of accessibility on your page. And once it's done, I'll be able to highlight any of the accessibility errors and kind of point those out. So for example, if I click on the very first one, highlight where it's happening, and what it's saying is it's complaining about the ID. So this is a documentation error. So I know that all of my examples should have unique IDs. And I can even figure out solutions as I scroll down and kind of figure out what they suggest I do with that. So that's kind of a quick way you can check for accessibility errors. And then if I move on to keyboard, if I press tab to go through my page, I go to where I want to test, press enter, I'm in the dropdown. I can use my arrow keys to go down, and I can go up, and so I can interact with everything I need to. I can press escape and leave that interaction, and so that would pass my keyboard test. Now I'm going to turn on voiceover. It'll probably talk over me, so I'm going to tell you, I'm going to run through the different headings that it has, and then I'll show you what it actually sounds like as it goes through the dropdown.
Voice to enable screen reader approvals banner hidden. Main. Drop-down React HTML design, head, form controls menu, no items in web spots menu, tables menu, landmarks menu, articles menu, window spots menu, links menu, heading menu, heading level 3, basic, drop-down, menu pop-up collapsed button, drop-down, menu pop-up expanded, menu drop-down 7 items, link, menu item 1 of action, menu item 2 of 7, disabled link, menu item 3 of 7, disabled horizontal splitter 5, separated link, separated action, menu drop-down, menu pop-up collapsed button. You are voiceover off.
So as you can see, I kind of was able to go through all the drop-down items and hear what that might sound like. All right, in terms of resources, as long as this opens back up, there we go. All right, there are a lot of resources out there that can help you when you're considering accessibility. We have our own accessibility guide, but there are also lots of resources online. We should always check if there's an established practice, which is going to be through WCAG, but if you can't find anything firm, there's often articles documenting others who've done it before. However, you should still try and test what you're building. Just because you're following a good pattern doesn't always mean that your specific implementation is accessible. So definitely test across use cases and platforms through a keyboard or one or more screen readers. And if you're stuck, ask for help. There are a ton of forums and communities out there that help each other with accessibility. So let's build something cool and accessible, because friends don't let friends ship inaccessible code. Thank you.
All right, great job, Jessie. Thank you so much for your presentation. And I'm going to ask all of our presenters to come back up on stage. We're going to do a short Q&A session. So if you all have any questions for any of our speakers, please make sure that you are adding them in the Q&A tab so that I can ask them at this time. All right. Hello, welcome back, everybody. All right, let's get started with some of the questions that we had from the audience. For Kilian, we had a question that was asking about how do users typically choose something like reduced motion?
Yeah, so those are available in your operating system settings. So on a Mac, for example, you can go to System Preferences, Accessibility, Display, and there you'll have basically all the options I spoke about. So reduce motion, increase contrast, invert colors, and Windows and Linux have similar options like that. Now, I am obliged to say that if you do not want to go to your operating system all the settings all the time, you can use Polypane, and it just has a toggle that you can click like right in the UI to switch between reduce motion and not.
Great, thank you so much. And now we have a couple questions for Theresa and Brian. The first one is from someone who says that they are a traditional qualitative researcher and they're interested in transitioning to UX research, and they're asking about what their first big step should be.
I think I'd start with a gap analysis and do some self-evaluation against, and what we presented is not the end-all and be-all, but look at that, particularly around the methods and responsibilities in what a user researcher would do. Since you do have qualitative skills, look primarily for the methods that are around quantitative and focus on those. And then I'd suggest doing a little bit of qualitative research yourself and looking at some of the industries you might be interested in and looking at what they're listing in terms of job postings out there on LinkedIn or Indeed or other places.
Yeah, I'll add to that. When I was applying for internships and full-time jobs, kind of what I focus on mainly in all my interviews was a project that I did. So if you can get your hands on some hands-on experience, I think when I was in grad school, I did a project on the ESPN app, and then interviewers would always ask me about how I improved that for them. So yeah, if you can get any experience with a side project, I think that's a first great step to get exposure.
Great. Those are some great suggestions. And we also have another question for you too. This is about how much you think portfolios factor into hiring.
Yeah, so I can start off with that one. I think when we were looking through the job descriptions, a portfolio wasn't like a mandatory thing that people had to have. I will say, I think what's most important is that you can explain one project really well, regardless if you have a portfolio or not. I know when I started applying and I just like did not have time to do a portfolio, a lot of companies just asked that I send them one project, and that was generally fine. So it helps if you have one, but it's not the end of the world if you don't, in my opinion.
Yeah, I'd agree with exactly what you said. Yep.
Cool. And then I had a question for Jessie, especially when it comes to, you talked a lot about the development side. I want to talk to you about how do we cross that bridge when we're talking with UX designers and the front-end developers. How do we work together to make sure that our designs are accessible and are easy to make accessible through code?
Yeah, thank you. I think that whenever the designers and developers are talking more, I think that's always the best thing. So when it comes to design, our developers try to get involved, and they try to go to our something called a design share. And so the designers will say, hey, this is what I'm thinking of doing. And the developers might point out something that might be wrong with it, or, oh, what would you have for an accessible name for this? What would the expected interaction pattern be? I might ask a question of like, okay, well, what would you think of for the keyboard? Like, this might be more complicated. So how would they be able to do the same things? And a lot of it's just asking questions and having those conversations. Some of these things, there's not always like a very specific answer right away. And so when you talk about them and you think through those interactions, it really helps to kind of figure that out ahead of time. And then when the developers ask questions too, that's always really helpful as well. Maybe they've started that development process and then a question comes up and I think, oh, well, I need to now ask what this interaction should be, or something different happened than I expected. So having that dialogue back and forth can really be helpful for that process.
That's great. And then I have one last question for Jasmine. So with subjective research, I'm interested in how do we use that lens when we're looking at data that is mainly quantitative, when it's just numbers on a spreadsheet?
So numbers have bias in them as well, obviously. People bring themselves into it, right? So a large part of subjective research is that internal work. It's understanding that you have a lens. So even when you're looking at something that you think is quantitative without any sort of bias, it could exist because of who gave you the numbers and how you collected those numbers, right? There's a lot of work right now around the bias that exists in data and huge data sets. And so it applies even when you're moving through work that feels very technical or very sort of outside of just person-to-person relationships.
All right, awesome. That was a great answer. Thank you all for submitting some questions. And again, thank you for joining us for our lightning talks. The last thing that I want to shout out is that Triangle UXPA is looking for speakers for upcoming lightning talks on tools and processes. So if you are a UX professional that wants to do a 10-minute talk, just like the 5 of them did, please go to the tryuxpa.org website and you'll find more information there. But that's all we have for you today. And in about 5-10 minutes, we'll start with our next keynote session with Antoinette. So I'll see you all there. Bye, everybody.
Thank you.